Hi there, friends. Welcome to story time for our 8 to 12-year-old group. How are you doing today? I hope that you are having a wonderful day so far. We are continuing to read The Indian in the Cupboard by Lynne Reid Banks. We are getting ready to start chapter 6. The last thing that we had read was when Omri had left to go to school and left Little Bear at home. He had brought Tommy, the medic, to life to fix Little Bear's leg, and then he left. But he had given Little Bear some different things to work on so he could build a long house, the kind of house that an Indian needed. And he quickly grabbed a knight from his tin of plastic men and put him in and got a battle axe so that Little Bear would have an axe to work with. It wasn't quite the right axe, but all he did was quickly put the knight in the cupboard, bring him to life, take the axe, and then send him back to being plastic. So he didn't let that person be alive. But here's our next chapter, chapter 6. The chief is dead. Long live the chief. He got to school early by running all the way. The first thing he did was to head to the school library shelves for a book on Indians, and to his joy, he soon found one under the section labeled Peoples of the World, a book called On the Trail of the Iroquois. Iroquois is the type of Indian that Little Bear is. He couldn't take it out because there was nobody there to write him down for it, but he sat down then and there on a bench and began to read it. Now, Omri was not what you'd call a great reader. He couldn't get into books somehow unless he knew them already. And how, as a teacher never tired of asking, was he ever going to get to know any more books until he read them for the first time? And this, On the Trail of the Iroquois, was not exactly a comic. Tiny print, hardly any pictures, and no fewer than 300 pages. Getting into this was obviously out of the question, so Omri just dipped. He managed to find out one or two fairly interesting things straight away. Iroquois Indians were sometimes called the Five Nations. One of the five were the Mohawks, a tribe Omri had heard of. They had indeed lived in longhouses, not teepees, and their main foods had been maize and squash, whatever they were, and beans. These vegetables had for some strange reason been called the Three Sisters. There were many mentions of the Algonquins as the Iroquois' enemies, and Omri confirmed that the Iroquois had fought beside the English while the Algonquins fought for the French sometime in the 1700s, and that both sides had scalped like mad. Remember way back in one of the early chapters, Omri was just shocked that Little Bear had fought in the war and scalped, and he thought that was appalling, but both sides were doing it. So he just realized, he made that discovery here. At this point, he really began to get interested. The book, in its terribly grown-up way, was trying to tell him something about why the Indians had done such a lot of scalping. Omri had always thought it was just an Indian custom, but the book seemed to say that it wasn't at all, at least not till the white man came. The white man seemed to have made the Iroquois and Algonquin keen on scalping each other, not to mention white men, French or English as the case might be, by offering them money and whiskey and guns. Omri was deep in the book, frowning heavily, several minutes after the bell had rung. Someone had to tap him on the shoulder and tell him to hurry up to his assembly. The morning lasted forever. 3 times his teacher had cause to tell Omri to wake up. At last, Patrick leaned over and whispered, "You're even dreamier than usual today. What's up?" "I'm thinking about your Indian." "Listen," hissed Patrick. "I think you're putting me on about this Indian. It was nothing so marvelous. You can buy them for a few pence at Yap's." Yap's was the local news agent and toy shop. "I know, and all the equipment for them." "I'm going shopping at lunch break. Are you coming?" "We're not allowed out of school at lunch unless we eat at home. You know that." "I'm going anyway. I've got to." Go after school. No, I've got to go home after school. What? Aren't you staying to skateboard? Omri and Patrick, will you kindly stop chattering? They stopped. At long last, lunchtime came. I'm going. Are you coming? No, Patrick said. There'll only be trouble. I can't help that. You're a twit. Twit or not, Omri sneaked out, ran across the playground, through a hole in the fence. The front gate was kept locked to keep the infants from going into the road. And in 5 minutes, by running all the way, he had reached Yap's. The selection of plastic figures there was good. There was one whole box of mixed cowboys and Indians. Omri searched till he found a chief wearing a cloak and a full feather headdress, with a bow in his hand and a quiver full of arrows slung across his back. Omri bought it with part of his lunch money and rushed back to school before he couldn't be missed. He showed the chief to Patrick. Why get another Indian? Only for the bows and arrows. Patrick was now looking at him as if he had gone completely screwy. In the afternoon, mercifully, they had had 2 periods of handcrafts. Omri had completely forgotten to bring the teepee he'd made, but there were plenty of scraps of felt, sticks, needles, and thread lying about in the handicrafts room, and he'd soon made another one, but much better than that first. Sewing has always bored him rigid, but now he sat for half an hour stitching away without even looking up. He was trying to achieve that patched look of the real teepee made of odd-shaped pieces of hide, and he also found a way of branching the sticks so that they didn't fold up every time they were nudged. Very good, Omri, remarked his teacher several times. What patience, all of a sudden. Omri, who usually liked praise as much as anyone, hardly even heard her. He was concentrating so hard. After a long time, he became aware that Patrick was standing over him, breathing through his nose rather noisily to attract his attention. Is that for the Indian? My Indian. Yes. Why are you doing it in bits like that? To be like a real one. Real ones have designs on. So will this. He's going to paint proper Iroquois ones. Who is? Little Bear. That's his name. Why not call him Running Nose? Said Patrick with a grin. Omri looked at him blankly. Because his name is Little Bear, he said. Patrick stopped grinning, and then he frowned. I wish you'd stop this stupid business, he said peevishly, going on as if it were a joke. Omri went on looking at him for a moment, and then went back to his bracing. Each pair of sticks had to have another short stick glued between them. It was quite tricky. Patrick stood a minute and then said, Can I come home with you today? No, I'm sorry. Why not? Mum's having guests, Omri mumbled. He didn't tell lies very well, and Patrick knew at once it was a lie, and he was hurt. Oh, all right then, be like that, he said, and stalked off furiously. The afternoon ended at last. Omri accomplished the walk home with the normal dawdling took a half an hour in little over 10 minutes. He arrived sorely out of breath and greeted his surprised mother. Have you developed a jet engine, or have you been expelled? With a lot of gasping, had a request to go straight to his room without waiting for tea. What have you been up to up there? There's an awful mess on the floor. Looks like bits of grass and bark. And where did you get that beautiful little Indian teepee? I think it's made of real leather. Omri looked at her speechless. He began at last. Telling lies to Patrick was one thing. Lying to his mother was quite something else, and he never did it unless the emergency was dire. But mercifully, the phone rang just then, so he was spared for the moment. He darted upstairs. There was indeed a fair odd mess, though no worse than he often left it himself when he'd been working on something. Little Bear and the horse were nowhere to be seen, but Omri guessed where to look, behind the dressing-up crate. A wonderful sight met his eyes. A long house, not finished, but no less interesting and beautiful for that, stood on the seed box, with smooth surface was now much trampled over. There were hooves as well as moccasin prints. Omri saw that a ramp made of part of the bark had been laid against the side of the wooden box, up which the horse had been led. To Omri's delight, odd as it may seem, a tiny pile of horse manure lay on the ramp as proof of the horse's passing. It's funny that he would find that interesting, but I guess it was. And there he was, tied by a thread to an upright twig, hammered, presumably, into the ground, munching a small pile of grass that the Indian had carried up for him. Little Bear himself was still working so intently that he didn't even notice that he was not alone. Omri watched him in utter fascination. The long house was about half finished. The twigs, which had been taken from the birch tree on the lawn, had been stripped of their bark, leaving them shining white. Each one had been bent into an arch, the ends thrust into the earth, and cross pieces lashed on the sides with thread. More and more twigs, which were stout poles to the Indian, had been added, with never a nail or a screw needed to strengthen the structure, and now Little Bear had begun to fix flakes of bark like tiny little tiles onto the cross pieces. He was seated on the roof itself, his feet locked around the main roof pole, which ran the length of the house, hanging these bark tiles, each of which he would first carefully shape with his knife. The knight's battle-axe lay on the ground beside an unused pile of twigs. It had clearly been used to chop any strip them, and had been made to serve Little Bear's purpose very well. At last Omri saw him straighten up, stretch his arms toward the ceiling, and open his mouth in a tremendously noisy yawn. "Tired?" he asked him. Little Bear got such a fright he almost fell off the longhouse roof, and the horse neighed and tugged at his rope. But then Little Bear looked up and saw Omri hanging over the crate far above him and grinned. Here is a picture of what that looks like. Remember, this book doesn't have many illustrations, but it does have that one. Little Bear, tired, work many hour. Look, make longhouse. Work for many braves. I make alone. Also, not good tools. Axe Omri give heavy. Why no tomahawk? Omri was getting used to his Indian's ungrateful ways and was not offended. He showed him the teepee he'd made. "I suppose you won't want this now that you've got your longhouse," he said rather sadly. Want. He seemed to have decided teepees had their usefulness after all. He cried, "Good. Give paints. Make pictures." Omri unearthed his poster paints. When he came back with them, he found Little Bear sitting cross-legged on the earth, facing the figures of the chief that Omri had put next to the teepee. Little Bear was clearly puzzled. "It's plastic," said Omri. "I bought it in a shop." "Plastic?" Little Bear stared at the figure with its big feather headdress. "You make magic, get bow and arrows from plastic." "Yes. Also make feathers real?" he asked with a gleam in his eye. "You like that headdress?" Little Bear like, but that for chief. Little Bear not chief, till father die. "But you could just try it on." Little Bear looked doubtful, but he nodded. "Make real, then see." Omri shut the Indian chief into the cupboard. Before he turned the key, he leaned down to where Little Bear was examining the, to him, enormous pots of paint. "Little Bear, are you lonely?" "Would you like a friend?" "Got friend," said the Indian, jerking his head toward the horse. "I meant another Indian?" Little Bear looked up swiftly, his hands still. There was a long silence. "Wife?" he asked at last. "No, it's a man," said Omri. The chief." "Not want," said Little Bear immediately, and he went back to his work with a bent head. Omri was disappointed. He had thought it might be fun to have 2 Indians, but somehow he couldn't do anything Little Bear didn't want. He would have to treat this chief as he had treated the knight, grab the weapons and turn him back into plastic again at once. Only this time it wasn't quite so easy. When he opened the cupboard, the chief was still sitting on the shelf, looking at him in bewilderment, blinking as the light struck his eyes. Omri saw at once that he was very old, covered in wrinkles. He took the bow out of his hand quite easily, but the quiverful of arrows was hung around him on a leather thong, and as for actually lifting the feather headdress clean off the gray old head, Omri found he just couldn't bring himself to do it. It just seemed so rude. The old man gazed up at him blankly, at first, and then with the dawning terror. But he didn't get up, and he didn't speak, though Omri saw his lips moving and noticed he had hardly any teeth. Omri somehow felt that he should offer the old chief some friendly word to reassure him, so he held up one hand as white men had sometimes done in the films. They were treating Indian chiefs with politeness, and said, "How?" The old Indian lifted a trembling hand, and then suddenly he slumped to his side. Little Bear, quick, get onto my hand." Omri reached down, and Little Bear climbed onto his hand from the longhouse roof. "What?" The old Indian, "I think he fainted." He carried Little Bear to the cupboard, and Little Bear stepped off onto the shelf. He stooped beside the crumpled figure, taking the single feather out of the back of his own headband, and held it in front of the old man's mouth. Then he shook his head. "Dead," he said. "No breath. Heart stop. Old man. Gone to ancestors. Very happy." Without more ado, he began to strip the body, taking the headdress, the arrows, and the big richly decorated cloak for good measure. Omri was shocked. "Little Bear, stop! Surely you shouldn't." "Chief dead. I only other Indian here. No one else to be chief. Little Bear chief now," he said, whirling the cloak about on his own bare shoulders and clapping the splendid circle of feathers around his head with a flourish. He picked up the quiver. "Omri, give bow," he commanded. And it was a command. Omri obeyed it without thinking. "Now, you make magic deer for Little Bear to hunt, fire for cook, good meat." He folded his arms, scowling up at Omri. Omri was quite taken aback by all this. While giving Little Bear every respect as a person, he was not about to be turned into a slave. He began to wonder if giving him those weapons, let alone making himself a chief, was such a good idea. "Now look here, Little Bear," he began in a teacherish tone. "Omri!" It was his father's voice, fairly roaring at him from the foot of the stairs. Omri jumped, bumping the cupboard. Little Bear fell over backward, considerably spoiling his dignity. "Yes, come down here this instant." Omri had no time for courtesies. He snatched Little Bear up and set him down near the half-finished longhouse, shut the cupboard, and ran downstairs. His father was waiting for him. "Omri, have you been in the greenhouse lately?" And did you, while you were in there, remove a seed tray planted out with marrow seeds, may I ask?" "Well, Yes or no?" "Well, yes, but—" "And is it possible that in addition you have been hacking at the trunk of the birch and torn off strips of bark?" "But, Dad, it was only—" "Don't you know trees can die if you strip too much off their bark off? It's like their skin. As for the seed tray, that is mine. You have no business taking things from the greenhouse, and you know it. Now, I want it back, and you better not have disturbed the seeds, or heaven help you." Omri swallowed hard. He and his father stared at each other. "I can't give it back," he said at last, "but I'll buy you another tray and some more seeds. I've got enough money. Please." Omri's father had a quick temper, especially about anything concerning the garden, but he was not unreasonable. And above all, he was not the sort to pry into his children's secrets. He realized at once that his seed tray, as a seed tray, was lost to him forever, and that it was not use hectoring Omri about it. "All right," he said, "you go to the hardware shop and buy them, but I want them today." Omri's face fell. "Today? But it's nearly 5 o'clock." "Precisely. Be off." And that's the end of that chapter. So it's interesting how the customs of Little Bear are so different to Omri, and he is so shocked by the things that Little Bear did. Like when the chief had died, Little Bear just started taking all of the things that belonged to the chief because that's what they would do so somebody else could be the chief, like to take his place. And so since Little Bear was the only other Indian there, he knew that's what he needed to do. And Omri was so completely shocked by that, to take all those things off of a person who had just died. And so Omri is learning a lot about a completely different culture that all he ever knew about it was what he had seen on TV or in films or movies or things like that. So very interesting things are going to be coming up as well. So we are going to be, the next time we get together, reading chapter 7 called Uninvited Brothers. So that might be interesting to see what happens if his brothers come into the room and find Little Bear. So I hope you are enjoying The Indian in the Cupboard. It is truly one of my favorites, and I truly enjoy reading it. And I'm glad that you are able to join me as I do. So I hope that you are continuing to enjoy it as well, and I will see you back the next time. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, guys.